Hello everyone, this is ETV Investors Cafe and I'm Santayo Tamrat with this edition. With this edition, I'll try to focus on the investment opportunities in Ethiopia, the challenges some investors face and the ways out. And my guest today is Medena Nagato, who is Africa's top business leader. He is currently working as a global chairman of the American investment firm called Fairfax Africa Fund. Medena has been just working overseas in different countries in Latin America, the US, the Middle East, and throughout Africa. Thank you so much for staying with me. I'm Santayo Tamrat with this edition. A very warm welcome to you, Medena.
Thank you for having me.
Would you just share me your evaluation of Ethiopia's performance in attracting foreign direct investment?
First of all, thank you for having me. So, with regards to the Ethiopia's attraction for foreign direct investors, which is the question you're asking me, I think it's good to put things in perspective. So, over the last number of years, if you look at the annual report that has been issued by UNCTAD, which is part of the United Nations, they have ranked Ethiopia amongst the 5 largest recipients of FDI in Africa. And this goes back to the last several years, actually. So usually it's in 3rd, 4th, certainly in the top 5. So that's an indication that obviously there's a lot of interest in investing in Ethiopia. Even the last 3 years during COVID, when there was, a lot of challenges globally, the FDI numbers kind of held steady with slight declines. And then this past year, I believe Ethiopia was number 4. So even just last year, with all the challenges that the country was facing, both internally but also from the global challenges from post-COVID, when the country in Africa and the globe was trying to recover. So in that, if you look at that as a reference point, it's encouraging. Now, I've always said that not just Ethiopia, by the way, all of Africa is not getting its fair share. I mean, if you look at the African number, for example, Africa in total gets about $50 billion of FDI, which is, 2% of global FDI, okay? That being what it is, if you look at Ethiopia, as I said, it actually is receiving a pretty significant sum of that 50 billion. That 50 billion is for 54 countries. Sure. So when you start pulling in 3-4 billion a year, and one year I remember Ethiopia accounted for about 10% of Africa's total FDI. Now obviously the last couple of 3 years has been a challenging year for the country. So, but even then it's kind of held steady. Now we don't know what that number will be this year. We'll see when the year ends. So that's one reference point. However, the Ethiopian economy is the 3rd largest in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the new number that came out 2 weeks ago says it's 127 billion. So it's, by African standards, it's pretty substantial. So when you look at the size of the economy, especially considering its potential for growth, it needs to bring in more FDI, and it can, okay? So the short answer to your question is done well, relatively speaking, because it's comparative, right? I mean, sure. But I think going forward, it can do even better. I mean, I think if you get 3-4 billion a year, my view has always been Ethiopia can bring in, I would say, about $10 billion. Now, it's important to remember, about 10 years ago, it was less than $1 billion. I mean, what is it now? We're in 2022. Yeah, around 2012, 2013, if you look at the data, it was actually less than $1 billion that Ethiopia was receiving. So it went from there to about 3-4 billion. But as I said, my view is it can pull in about 10 billion, 8 to 10 billion sustainably over the next several years. Now we can talk about the details, where it's going to come from, but the macro view of to answer your question, at the macro level, this is what the picture looks like.
That's good. And just to have a very good picture or a very good number of foreign direct investment in Ethiopia, there must be some opportunities. And how do you explain these opportunities in Ethiopia offered by the government and the agroclimatic situation and so on?
So, and then we need to link the investment topic to the country's priorities. And that's where I think it would make sense for you viewers to understand. So if you look at the government strategy that came out about almost 3 years ago now, the Homegrown Economic Reform Program, and then subsequently the Prospective 10-Year Plan, they have identified 5 sectors as priority sectors. So for example, manufacturing is one of them, tourism is another, natural resources, ICT, and agriculture. So these are like the 5 pillars. Now, within each one of them, there are subsectors, right? So when we talk about manufacturing, Ethiopia has excellent opportunity to attract labor-intensive manufacturing, in clothing, shoes, that kind of stuff. You know, one of the reasons I always focus on this is because labor-intensive industries that used to go to China are now looking for another place, another destination to replicate China, because the Chinese have become very affluent. They're the second largest economy in the world. They don't want to be doing those kinds of things. So they've been looking for a long time to find the next China, albeit on a smaller scale, because nothing can compare to China population-wise, GDP-wise. So they went to, for example, to places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, and then Ethiopia. So if you look at the industrial parks in Ethiopia today, clothing manufacturing, for example, very significant investment have been made in those sectors because the infrastructure exists, the industrial parks, the labor pool is widely available. Ethiopia has about 45 million young, deployable, trainable workforce. Very productive too, right? I can tell you from our experience. So those kinds of industries like the clothing, the shoe manufacturing, anything electronics where they can use a lot of labor, Ethiopia could be competitive. So when we talk about where is the investment going to come from, the FDI is going to come from, these are the sectors that have been attracted. Agro-processing. So I'm talking about within the manufacturing component. So manufacturing certainly would be attractive. The other one is the natural resource space, mining, for example. If you look at Ethiopia's performance from, say, 3 years ago, from an export perspective, because a lot of what gets mined needs to be exported, right? I remember seeing some data. It was less than $100 million. Last year, it was over $500 million by just tweaking little policies here and there. So you can imagine, by making a lot of reforms in that sector, by incentivizing, for example, artisanal miners, and other types of incentives, or inviting big mining companies into the gold, tantalum, potash, and all these other things I think Ethiopia has, and then gas. Recently there was a news item, which I actually tweeted about it because the number was very significant. Ethiopia has certified, it's certified that Ethiopia has about 7 trillion cubic feet of gas. Okay, that's pretty significant. It's monetizable. I remember it used to be speculated that was 3 to 4 trillion. Now it's double. So the natural resource space, I think, can also be a major area for foreign investors to come in and invest. Agriculture. Now, even today, the Ethiopian economy, I would say about 60% of the GDP is accounted for by agriculture. But what is happening, and we've seen this in the last few months, maybe the last year or so, it's moving from basic farming, subsistence farming, relative backward farming to mechanized industrial scale, okay? And I have to tell you, if we look at the data, Ethiopia has about 74 million hectares of arable land. Now, by some estimates, it's actually over 100 million, okay? But let's just take the 74 million. Today, only 16 million is cultivated out of the 74 million. So there's another 50 million that could be cultivated. On top of that, as I said, if you modernize it, mechanize it, we showed some beautiful pictures recently of combiners and harvesters being deployed across Ethiopia, which is pretty remarkable. So agriculture, both the farming part of it, but also moving up the value chain, it provides very extensive opportunities. Simple example.
Even for agro-processors.
Exactly. So let's talk about coffee. Ethiopia's coffee is obviously one of the best in the world, if not the best, right? High value, but it's being sold as a commodity, right? We don't add value. Today, Nescafe, which is a very well-known brand around the world, or Folgers, and Maxwell House, these are Western brands which use Ethiopian coffee, are made abroad. So the idea, the strategy is, why don't we do that here? Just like we've started doing in the clothing business, for example, where the entire process is finished here and you actually attach the price tag here and you just export it. Why can't we do the same thing? So that's another opportunity for agriculture, not only the farm level, but the value addition component of it, okay? So I would say there's very significant opportunity. When we talk about agriculture, by the way, it's not just for domestic consumption. I mean, I've been reading a lot lately about wheat. Ethiopia, by the way, most people don't recognize this, but it's the second largest producer of wheat in Africa already. Obviously because it has a large population and the production is not sufficient for domestic. But the way it's progressing now, I think I saw news stories that Ethiopia is actually going to be a net exporter of wheat probably next year. I know it's been negotiating with Kenya and other countries. Yeah, sure. So you can imagine, you replicate the success of wheat in other agriculture sectors, okay? I travel a lot to the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and UAE. If you go to any of the grocery stores in Dubai, for example, almost everything is imported because they can't produce anything there. It's a desert. The same with the Saudis, the Qataris. And Ethiopia is only, 2.5, 3 hours away from Dubai, an hour and a half, 1 hour, 50 minutes from Saudi Arabia and from Jeddah. So Ethiopia actually can export and address the food security needs of these countries, of these neighboring countries, which are pretty close to Ethiopia. So when we think of agriculture, we need to think broader in the sense that it can go beyond local consumption, and it could be actually a very significant export generator for Ethiopia. And that's where I think investors can also be engaged because they earn hard currency, they address some of the food security. I mean, in the Gulf, they have plenty of petrodollars, but there's very little they can do about farming the desert, right? So I think Ethiopia could also be a very attractive place to invest in the value addition component, as well as in the actual on-the-ground farming, through contract farming, for example. Okay, so Saudi companies, UAE agriculture companies can invest in that sector and benefit both the country in Ethiopia, but also their countries as well. So agriculture. Let me come to the other one, the fourth one, which is tourism. Because we're talking about what are the areas that could attract investment, right? I mean, that's the main discussion you're asking me. So tourism, by all accounts, and we need to be honest, over the years has been an underperforming sector. I think there's always been an ambivalence, I think, from the Ethiopian side about how to promote it, how much to invest in it, which now has changed from what I see. The government is very laser beam-like focused on making sure that tourism, and it is doable. Ethiopia's neighbor, Kenya, for example, brings in about 2 million plus tourists every year. The last data we have for Ethiopia, pre-COVID, because you need to go back pre-COVID, yeah, sure, was less than 1 million. And I believe it was 800,000. So you can imagine the upside potential of tourism. There's a lot of tourist destinations in Ethiopia, from the historical tourism to everything. I always joke that the only thing that Ethiopia doesn't have from a tourist attraction is the beach. So maybe you can tag Ethiopian visit to, Mombasa beaches or something, but that's about the only thing it doesn't have. So that, I think, will be a major exciting sector. Now, lots of hotels infrastructure has been built, sure, but I think the promotional aspects of it, creating the awareness that this is a fantastic destination. The weather is absolutely beautiful in Ethiopia. So I think tourism can also, because it generates not only hard currency, but it can generate millions of jobs. When I talk about tourism, I always link it to the fact that the biggest airline in Africa is based in Ethiopia, Ethiopian Airlines. And if you look at the pre-COVID passenger numbers, which they're reaching again now this year, it's about 14 million, 13 to 14 million. So my view has always been, if Ethiopia can manage to get say 20% of those, because most of them are transit passengers from around the world. So what Ethiopia can do is very easily target 15 to 20% of those to visit Ethiopia, even for a day or two. You can imagine that how significant. I mean, 20% of 14 million is almost 3 million, 2.5 to 3 million. So it has the potential, because there's a lot of countries in Africa who don't even have an airline and have a bigger tourist numbers than Ethiopia. So with a coordinated effort, with a strategy focused on promoting that, as is being done now, I think the tourism sector could actually generate jobs and foreign exchange. And for investors, there's a lot of opportunity in that area. And the final one is ICT. I know for some this may not seem like an obvious sector when you talk about as a priority sector, but I think there's a logic to it. Look at the opening up of the telecom sector, for example, the last 18 months, right? I mean, a sector that was a monopoly for 126 years by one state-owned telecom company now has opened up. We have Safaricom, well, the Safaricom consortium, which includes Vodacom and Vodafone in the UK. They have now started offering services in Ethiopia. Ethio Telecom has expanded service. Now they have 65 million subscribers. The bandwidth, the technology, even the connection that you see here today, for example, is extremely reliable. And we're sitting here in Addis Ababa, right? So some of the fundamentals, the requirements for having a vibrant ICT sector, which is the vibrant telecom sector, the backbone, is starting to get there. Layer that with a lot of talented young Ethiopians, coders, software developers, app developers. I don't see any reason why this cannot be Silicon, I don't know, Ethiopia, as they call Silicon Valley in California, Silicon Savannah in Kenya. I don't see any reason why Ethiopia could not be in that same league. At the moment, a lot of we track funding into the technology sector in Africa. Today, most of the VC funding, the venture capital funding for startups in the technology space goes to 4 countries, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, and Kenya. But if you look right below them, one of the up-and-comers is Ethiopia. So I think ICT. So these are the 5 buckets that I talked about: manufacturing, natural resources, agriculture, ICT, okay, and tourism. These are the pillars that Ethiopia has actually both a competitive and a comparative advantage to compete globally. And for that reason, I think the ability to attract FDI in these sectors, I think, are very significant.
So that's really a very nice mentioning. And as you have already mentioned, the telecom sector has been opened up for the private sector, which was just owned by the government only for 126 years, as you said. What does this and the opening up of other sectors, like, for example, the government even announced it or implied that it would open the aviation industry as well and the energy sector. Right. So what do you think this means to the global investors that would like to come to Ethiopia?
Simple word. Ethiopia is open for business. I mean, I think that's the best way to just, if we are to give it a tagline, open for business, right? But I will answer yours specific. So one of the most exciting reforms, what I call a mega reform that has happened in the last 2 years in the economic sector is telecoms. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to believe that this was a monopoly for 126 years. I mean, really, a lot of countries had opened up the telecom sector, even in Africa, 15, 20 years ago. So Ethiopia was like one of the last, if not the last country on earth. I heard there were 2 or 3 other countries, but we won't mention them. So that was a real big, bold decision, transformational, because today everything runs on technology. You know, you and I cannot be communicating like this. You cannot be broadcasting your program without the use of these fancy technology items that then need connection to the global network and all that. And that runs on very powerful, very sophisticated telecom infrastructure, okay? So the opening up the telecom sector, on one hand, as I said, says welcome, welcome to investors. Let me just relate that to what we had experienced. Over the years, we've done a lot of global investment roadshows to promote investments in Ethiopia, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia. I mean, we've been everywhere. So we present, you know, a realistic but a very attractive picture of the opportunities in Ethiopia. And everybody says, well, this is good, we like it. And a lot of them actually did come and invest. But there were two very consistent questions we always got asked, okay? When is Ethiopia going to open up its telecom sector? I mean, that seemed like a deal killer for a lot of people, because what country doesn't open up its telecom it just gave Ethiopia a bad rap. That's gone now. Nobody asks that anymore. The second, we've been asked repeatedly, because I was always sometimes we were on the defensive, like how do we explain it? The second one was, when is Ethiopia going to open up its banking sector? I mean, this was like, so we talk about, invest in manufacturing, we tell them invest in agriculture, invest in all this in X, Y, and Z. And they say fine, and I said a lot of, but there was this lingering doubt. Why is this country not opening up its telecom? Why is it opening up its banking? Those answers, now they can't ask those anymore, okay? Telecom has opened up, as you know. Safaricom is coming, Vodacom is coming. In fact, I saw that in less than 6 months, they've signed up 1 million subscribers. It shows you that, there is the demand there. And the fact that these people took the chance to invest in Ethiopia, obviously very happy. Like I'm talking about Safaricom. And you can see the explosive growth they will be having in this country. The same thing in the banking sector recently. After 50 years of prohibiting foreign banks, Ethiopia made the decision that why not? Why don't we let them in? Let them come in, let them compete. So the reforms are very significant. Okay, obviously these are really big reforms, but underneath it is the policy reforms, the changes that are being contemplated or in place. For example, about 2 years ago, the investment law was changed. Okay, I know we participated in the stakeholders meeting, and the final product we came out with was actually pretty good. It was trying to meet the global standard. In fact, at that time, like every other country, Ethiopia was benchmarking its performances using what's called the Doing Business Guide, which used to be published by the World Bank. Now, for whatever reason, the World Bank discontinued that thing, but it was designed to move Ethiopia from the 150 ranking, 160 ranking, into the top 50. And so what you see today, the investment laws are designed to attract. Almost everything is now open to foreign investors, except a few. Some are JV, some are, but by and large is now open up all the sectors and given a lot of incentives for investors to come in. So the reforms are holistic. Now there are some more to come, especially in the financial service sector. For example, finally, we're going to have a stock market.
Yeah, sure.
Big news, right?
Yeah.
Very big news. Again, it was difficult to understand why Ethiopia didn't have a stock market. We scoured the world. For example, an economy of Ethiopia's size, about close to $130 billion, that doesn't have a stock market anywhere in the world, you can't find. Okay? I mean, so Ethiopia...
Yeah, many African countries also do have that for a long time. Kenya, for example, has for 70 years stock market, and they have just benefited a lot.
Exactly. So it's a very odd situation to be in. I mean, actually, if you pick the three things I just mentioned, telecom sector, closed off. Banking sector, closed off. No stock market. Like, I have to be honest, sometimes as a foreign investor, maybe they might question, is this country really open for investment? It is, and as I said, is in the top 5 of FDI attraction. So when I mentioned to you earlier that Ethiopia can pull in 10 billion, it's because when I see these kinds of reforms, if it was bringing in 3 to 4 billion a year with some mega sectors closed off, you can imagine what would happen when, as it's open now, there's no reason why I can't get 10 billion a year, 8 to 10 billion easily. Okay, obviously a lot of work needs to be done, but it is doable. So this is what we see, both as, we work globally and we see other countries, what they're doing, and what opportunities others offer. But I think Ethiopia could, in an African context, in fact, in certain sectors, for example, one of the sectors we're in is clothing garment manufacturing. Ethiopia actually can compete with the best of the best in that sector, which would be countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh. Bangladesh exports $40 billion a year. Ethiopia's total garment export last year was, what, 300 million? So it's just getting started. and yet it has all the favorable conditions, if not better, than those two countries can produce, Vietnam or Bangladesh. With all due respect, they do fantastic. And actually, we've learned a lot from them. But I think Ethiopia can exceed them in terms of the ability to deliver in very large quantity, world-class products at affordable price. So that's why I'm always excited about the opportunity, but I also acknowledge a lot of work needs to be done.
Even the country has got logistics advantage, I guess.
Yes. So if you look at where Ethiopia is geographically, I mean, this is a gift from God. We didn't do anything, just God put us here. We did a mapping once, and we found out that half the global population is within 8 hours of Addis Ababa, of flying time. Okay? Because that means for timing-sensitive products that could be produced from here to be delivered in Europe in a day or two, perfectly. So geographically situated. However, the logistics aspects of it, the cost of logistics, which is now being addressed. As you know, there's a very significant push by Ethiopia through the Ministry of Transport to upgrade, to make the transport logistics sector world-class. It's in the works, but I think by the time it's fully deployed, the cost of, for example, shipping, and this is it's not unusual to Ethiopia. A lot of African countries are challenged by high logistics transportation costs. So I think then the logistics aspects of taking advantage of our location in Ethiopia, if you have competitive costs, then I think you'll be in an overall competitive position. Because today, at the factory gate, we're extremely competitive. So it's the final mile to get it to the port and then ship it from the port to the customer, what most African countries are struggling with. And Ethiopia is focusing on that. As I said, I've seen the 10-year, now there's a new 30-year transport master plan that just came out recently, which is good. It's designed, so for example, building dry ports across Ethiopia, extensive railway networks, the road networks, and other things. I think on the cargo flight, air cargo part of it is done. Ethiopian Airlines is, it's amongst the 10 largest air cargo operators in the world, amongst the top 10. So that part we got right. I think where the focus now is on the land transport and the entire ecosystem of transport. But the bottom line is extremely competitive, Ethiopia, as I said. And I think you can compete with the best of the best. And that's why, again, when you think of manufacturing in Africa, that's another thing you need to keep in mind is the Achilles heel for Africa for building a manufacturing base is the lack of energy and the affordability of energy. And I'll give you an example why I think Ethiopia has extreme advantage in this area. Today, electricity in Ethiopia is about 6 US cents per kilowatt hour. Okay? That's the standard measure that's used. If you go across the border into Kenya, it's 4 times expensive. 3 to 4 times. Just across the border. And actually, across East Africa, it's 5 to 6 times more expensive. Okay? There is no way you can compete globally with those kinds of costs, electricity costs. So, manufacturing, usually if you put manufacturing in Africa in the same sentence, it will be like an oxymoron, like people say, what the hell is he talking about? But I think in the case of Ethiopia, as I said, we have the energy component, availability and affordability. All the elements I talked about, widely available labor, affordable labor, the infrastructure that's being rolled out, and coherent policies. I think Ethiopia has a better than even chance of migrating very significantly into an industrial economy. At least today it's about 5% of its GDP. I think in the next, I believe 10 years, the target is 15, maybe to 20%. That's pretty significant. And that has a very good chance of achieving it. But as I said, needs a lot of work. It's being done, but we need to stay focused.